Welcome to A Healthy Dose of Humor, a podcast series that sets out to explore the intersection of humor and health. I've partnered with Leith, a creative agency with specialisms in advertising, communications, and health, to bring together patients, healthcare professionals, scientists, and advertising experts to debate and discuss all the ways that humor can help us communicate. So let's get stuck in. And in this episode, we're going to break down different types of humor and think about how they link to healthcare communications. Joining me for this conversation is Professor Sophie Scott, who is a British neuroscientist and director of the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. Her research investigates the cognitive neuroscience of voices, speech and laughter, particularly speech perception, speech production, vocal emotions, and human communication. Also joining us is Ash Dunne, originally trained as a geneticist and then playing with microscopes for Cancer Research UK. Ash has worked in medical communications for over 12 years. He is currently a scientific director for Merk's Neurology and Immunology Global Medical Communications. Being deeply nerdy, Ash loves getting stuck into data and developing scientific publications. He also believes that science should be accessible to non-scientists and works on lay summaries of medical research. In the past, Ash has performed as a stand-up comedian when he's not being a professional nerd, and still performs improv comedy and releases music. Also with us is Marion Miranda, a Singaporean in Scotland. Marion is an award-winning copywriter at Leith, where she works on a wide variety of health clients. She loves creative thinking and is always looking to create ads and messaging that will make you see differently. In 2023, she was a Cannes Young Lions Global Gold winner, representing the whole of the UK with her creative partner, Joe. So to dig straight into this, I want to talk about different types of humor and laughter. Sophie, we've all been in situations where laughter has helped diffuse an awkward situation or a moment, but we've also been in situations where it's made it much, much worse. So is there a science to being funny?
Well, with the proviso that one of the main things we've learned from the science of humor is that over time and over place, there's no one thing that absolutely everybody finds funny. There are some very general principles. So the less information you need to understand a joke or something that's funny, the more likely you are to find it funny. So that means that slapstick is the most sort of universal form of humor, or humor that you don't need words to explain. So people still find Laurel and Hardy funny, Mr. Bean, Benny Hill. These are things that can kind of transfer around the world, sometimes in a way that makes us just a bit embarrassed. But that's that's the bottom line. You don't need to know the language to understand the jokes there. As soon as there's language, then it's never just the language that's helping you get whether or not something's funny. So I speak French a bit, enough to be able to watch that TV show, Call My Agent, 10%, and I don't always have to use the subtitles. And quite often I can tell that something is meant to be funny. I never laugh because I might speak a bit of French, but I don't live in France and I don't understand the way that words can be used in complex ways, or you might have particular forms of kind of mottos or structures. I'm not getting that. I'm not getting the cultural references. And some scientists actually did do a study where they translated French jokes into Australian English and Australian English jokes into French and tested whether or not they stayed funny, and they do not. So there's that, it's not just a linguistic barrier, it's a cultural and a social barrier. And these are scientific theories that I sometimes think have been created by people who perhaps have never seen or found anything funny. But for example, there's a theory that, and the very general problem with this is that as soon as you have a theory of why this thing is funny, you will immediately think of something that doesn't explain. So for example, there is superiority theory. And that's the idea is that when you laugh at something, it's because it's made you feel better than someone else. So classic jokes where you are laughing at somebody. Maybe you're laughing at, when I was growing up, people used to make pointlessly cruel but very common jokes about Irish people. That was a thing. And it's not something that we like anymore. We don't do it, but it used to be a thing purely along that basis. You're laughing and you're feeling a bit better because you're laughing at someone else. That's going on.
Well, the Englishman, the Irishman, and the Scotsman joke utilizes a similar principle.
It's exactly that. And you find it everywhere. So in France, people would laugh at Belgian people. You know,
I think they still do.
I think they still.
I'm sorry, Belgium.
I'm very sorry, Belgium. You really don't deserve this rep. But you can immediately think of something like, well, why is a pun funny then?
Well, puns, interestingly, I can tell you this from personal experience, puns don't travel. Puns are very unique to the British, and obviously anyone else who speaks English will understand it, i.e. as a native language. I mean, Australians, Americans, Canadians. However, it's a very unique form of humor that the British love. They love a pun, but you go and gig in the continent, any joke that requires an understanding of the double entendre or the cultural context of that word, and it's lost. And even if they do understand it, they could understand what you're doing, but they don't find it funny.
So it's back to those barriers. Exactly. And then there's another idea which is called benign violations. And here the idea is that we laugh at stuff.
Sounds like my entire tour. I'm going to call my next tour benign violations.
I have to say the word benign is doing a lot of lifting in this description. So the idea is that things that are out of place, that they've got a kind of what scientists call an envelope violation. There's something where something shouldn't be. There's a violation, say, of a social norm, but it's benign, so it's not terribly bad.
Okay.
That's when things are funny. So there's a Lee Mack joke that goes, sorry, girls, I'm married, so it'll have to be your place. And that's a benign violation because you're expecting him to say, I'm married, so I can't come home with you. So that's so benign is doing a lot of work because generally out in the real world, when violations happen, it's awful and embarrassing. It might be painful. It might be frightening. You know, it's not, we don't like it when social norms are violated generally. So the benign is doing a lot of lifting. And then more recently, people have also argued that humor is just playfulness. It is just silliness, and there's lots of possible ways to that. But there was a really interesting scientific study a few years ago that put all of that to one side. And what they said was, we're going to treat humour as like a semantic property of things in the world. And we're going to ask people about things and just ask them if they're funny or not. So they got people to rate how funny words are, just words, single word of English. How funny is the word corridor? How funny is the word train? And what you find is, not too surprisingly, most words aren't very funny. Sorry.
No, I was about to name some that I think are funny. That we naturally moist. See, moist. It just, you say it and people go, hey, it creates a reaction, doesn't it? But as a comedian, there are words, there are numbers that we use because they have a greater effect. The age of 12 is funnier than the age of 14.
Beautiful. And then it's literally exactly. So you're doing naturally, you're collecting data. What they did just practically, they got people to rate it, and they do find a subset of words that are rated as being funny. And they collapse down into some of those same categories. So insult words are funny. Idiot is funny. And so you've got that kind of superiority thing does seem to be something that has a sort of funny property. And also taboo words are funny. Mm-hmm. So boobs is funny. And that's exactly, boobs, fart. You can probably imagine the taboo words. So there's some support actually.
That's all I'm doing now.
Yeah, he's making a list in his head.
So you've got these words that are, get these semantic properties that are corresponding to sort of benign violation and to superiority theory. But then you also find that some speech sounds, certainly for British English, are funny. So ooh is a funny vowel sound. Boon is rated as being funny. There's something funny about it in the mouth. Or k. So words with k sound in, like ankle or flank, are rated as funnier.
That's interesting. We definitely try and end punchlines with harder consonants than softer ones.
Yeah.
It's funny to so you might actually sit there as a writer and rearrange the sentence so that you end on repeat instead of end on again.
Yeah, yeah. So and in fact, if there's that old Walter Matthau film called The Sunshine Boys, where he's playing this old kind of borscht belt comedian from America, and he gives this whole speech about K sounds are funny, cockroach, that's funny, and he's exactly right. That whoever wrote that it's completely, this study brought it out.
I mean, two of our worst swear words. It's more satisfying, isn't it? Because one ends in a k sound, one starts in a k sound, and there's
you've got the violation in there as well. You've got the tabooness
and the violation
and the insult.
And it ticks all the boxes.
And it's interesting because with those words in particular, depending on where you are in the English-speaking world, they can be used very, very differently. Certainly from Merseyside, where I am, both of those words can be terms of endearment, or they can be invitations to a fight.
Yeah, same in Scotland.
Same in Scotland.
Yeah. Probably the same everywhere, I think, yes. And then we had one last category.
Okay.
Which was words that people just think are funny.
Oh.
Like moist.
Moist.
And like words like bebop. It doesn't correspond to any of those the other categories, but they are just funny to say. So there's something playful about some words.
I remember a best friend of mine in high school, Mana. From the Muppets.
Yeah.
Mana. Yeah, you can't not do that, can you? Mana. Yeah, see.
So what I think that study really shows us is that even if you do something really empirical and really hardcore, and you can get some like qualitative stuff coming out of that, it's still telling you the humour is quite complex. There's not one way of being funny. Sometimes it's about insulting things. Sometimes it's about something being in an unexpected place. Sometimes it's about it's about particular sounds, but sometimes it's just something that feels funny. So it's not one thing. Humor isn't just one thing. It's a world. Even if you take it down to single words, it's a world of really pretty nuanced phenomena that we will read humor into.
I think it's interesting what you were saying about, we'll never be able to go back and understand the Babylonian joke that you mentioned in the previous episode, or the Roman jokes that you mentioned today. Because to me, so much of humor is about communicating and sharing a sense of worldview. So, I tend to base whether or not I'm going to like somebody, based on a shared sense of humor. I met my wife through comedy. We had a shared sense of humor. And every friend that I have, which isn't a huge group, I tend to be one of these small group people, but it's all based around humor, because it's essentially a shorthand way of telling you, this is my belief about this is my belief about that, and this is my belief about that. And there will be differences, but it's humor for me is a very useful communication tool and shorthand way of expressing an overarching worldview. And I think that's probably why things don't travel in certain cultures and why things don't travel across time, because we don't live in that world. So it's impossible to share a worldview if that world no longer exists or exists and you've never been there. So given that we've agreed that some things are just funny, some words can just be funny, there's obviously social context to using words with humor, because we find that slapstick can be fairly universal and it transcends culture and it transcends language, possibly time, although will we ever know that? Are there certain topics or issues that are harder to be funny about? Do we have the opposite of that? Are there definite no-go areas? Are there definite things that if we are all laughing and someone brings it up, boom, that's it kills it? So the flip side, there must be.
I mean, if no one's laughing, then it's not funny.
Okay.
That's simply the bottom line. And there's different ways of dealing with that situation, but that's what's happening. So if no one's laughing, then it could just be that time, that place, that room, those people, it's not landing. It could be because there are people who've got like personal experiences that mean they're not. There was a fantastic, The Onion, the sort of spoof newspaper, had a headline. This is, I think, from the end of the 90s. And it was just entitled, "That's Not Funny, My Brother Died That Way." And it's people talking about, I see you're all enjoying talking about that scene in Police Academy where a man is thrown off the back of a motorcycle and gets his head stuck in a horse's anus. Well, actually that's how my brother passed away. And it's clever because it's basically, there'll always be the possibility there's somebody thinking that. It doesn't matter how, even if everyone else is generally finding that funny, that's the thing. So there's always a possibility that people have a completely personal reason why they're not laughing. But I think you could probably argue, and I know I've seen comedians argue this, that in theory there's no one thing that would never be funny. What it is how the audience are perceiving how you're telling that joke and how you're structuring it, such as what the point of the joke is. Are you laughing at the thing because you're suggesting that the thing itself is funny, or are you finding a way to laugh at the situation around that thing that might actually help people laugh at something that is unpleasant, that they can kind of turn it around?
I mean, that is interesting because that relies on the assumption that everybody will understand the intention or even understand the joke. I mean, Frankie Boyle has famously been to court more than once to defend his jokes, and he's come out on top, I think, pretty much every single time because he has been able to say, no, that was not what the butt of the joke was, as we say. That was not the brunt of the joke. I remember a famous situation with Catherine Ryan. She was on Mock the Week, and it was scenes, things you would not hear in an advert. And she came on stage and she said, none of our products have been tested on little Filipino boys. And that was the joke. And it actually got a lot of backlash from the Filipino community who said, that's not very nice, that's not very fair, you're making fun of us. And you go, well, actually, no, if you listen to it, that's not, the brunt of the joke is the cosmetic companies and the adverts that say we don't test on animals and we don't, and the fact that was still misunderstood. It could have been a cultural thing. I don't know how long the Filipino diaspora that complained had been in the UK versus homegrown. I don't have those answers, but it's interesting that humor it's a two-way thing, isn't it? There's what you intend, because I don't think any advertising company intends to insult when they put their work out, but we have seen it happen where adverts have had to been retracted or apologized for because they've missed the mark.
Yeah, I'm completely. And as I say, if no one's laughing, it's not funny. And it's, I think, in a very general sense, you could imagine a world in which people go to a comedy club and they think, well, do you know what? I won't necessarily find all of this funny, and that's all right. And a comedian could be thinking, not everyone's going to laugh at everything, and that's all right.
No comedian ever thinks that. No comedian walks in. In fact, I'm amazed at how many of my colleagues will walk in and walk off stage and go, oh, there's this one guy in the fifth row and he wouldn't laugh. He just kept his arms crossed the entire time. And I'm sitting there going, how did you, I avoid those people because they scares me. I'm just going to focus on those that are enjoying themselves because I'm really scared about what he's going to go and write on the internet after the show. Everybody else. But a lot of my colleagues will just focus on that one person.
It's kind of like airplane pilots where they have this whole array of dials, and the layperson thinks they're reading every dial, that are all in different positions. They're not. They're looking at the one dial that's suddenly done that, that has suddenly moved, because that's the dial they need to pay attention to. So I suspect it's the same thing when you're performing in front of a crowd. You can have 499 people laughing, or if you're a musician singing along to your song, but if you've got that one guy who's just going, nope, that's the person that you're going to focus on.
It's you can keep some people happy some of the time, but you'll never keep all of the people happy all of the time. But certainly in comedy, you can't keep none of the people happy all of the time. So you do have to be careful.
I do enjoy comedians who try to tackle topics that are controversial, and comedians can almost get away with it because their topic itself is humor. Whereas when it comes to advertising, we're not talking about humor. We're using humor as a method to then say something about the brand. So there is a clear difference there. But I do love a Frankie Boyle or a Jimmy Carr who try to say something quite shocking, but you're allowed to say it because that's exactly what you're challenging when you use comedy as both the medium and the message, I suppose.
I think they'll both be glad to hear that there's still people out there that appreciate that, because I think recently specifically, there's the world is changing as to what it believes or what it's saying you can and can't laugh about, which is interesting, brings us back kind of to what we've been talking about, is the science of being funny. Do you think that you write, Marion, you write ads for a living. Do you think that there's a science to being funny? And part of that is that we're allowed to be funny because that's our platform as comedians, but perhaps adverts have a uphill battle to climb because that's not part of their science?
For a brand to be funny, there's almost because like I said, it's a execution, right? So there's almost too many to name. Like it could be as subtle as wordplay, it could be as exaggerated as slapstick, and there are just like a very big range, and you have to adjust it based on what is true to your brand. So to me, the authenticity is the most important thing. I can give an example of a really authentic brand proposition, which is "You're not you when you're hungry." I don't know if you've seen Snickers adverts, and that's, I guess, based on the insight. I mean, they've had this phrase for such a long time before people were even talking about being hangry. It wasn't a thing back then, and they noticed that when you are hungry, you behave in strange ways. And I love ads that kind of tap into this kind of truth that when you're hungry, you're weaker, you're not quite yourself. And so they created these little skits where American football player plays like he's Betty White because you're not you when you're hungry, or a ninja does his mission as if he's Mr. Bean because you're not you when you're hungry. So that's quite a interesting insight. So I feel that in advertising, a great idea always has to be based on the truth, and some of those truths lend themselves really well to humor. Some of them don't. So it's not about like using humor for the sake of it. It's adjusting it so that it suits your brand.
Does that mean that some brands can't be funny, in your opinion? That it's too far removed from who they are?
I think it can always be adjusted. A good example is, I don't know if you've seen recent Magnum commercial. So this lady, she finds out that her husband's eating a fake Magnum, and she slowly reveals that everything in her life about him is fake. So his medals are fake, the weights that he carries, they're fake, even his mustache is fake. And on the surface, that sounds like quite a slapstick kind of sketch, right? But what the clever thing they did was that they used supermodels, and they filmed it with such like beautiful craft. It was like a movie. It was really pretty looking. So the craft kind of offset the slapstick, so it became a premium video. So I think there's always ways to adjust the dials in craft, in the idea, to suit your tone. And I think it is always possible for a brand to be funny, whether it's in a more subtle way with wordplay, or whether it's through craft or through just different ways of blending their message.
Understood. Are there places and spaces within the customer journey where you think there's more or less permission to be funny?
Yes. So in advertising, there's either brand building or there's a direct sales bit. So when you're scrolling through your phone, sometimes you see a pop-up 20% discount. That's a direct sales. You don't have a lot of time. You maybe have only a headline to read. They can be funny and they can be effective, but there's only so much. You only have like 2 seconds to be funny. So there's very little room to explore humor. Whereas a TV ad or a YouTube ad is around 30 seconds to 1 minute. And there you can almost treat it like a sketch. So you have time to build characters, build a story, say a punchline. A story goes in one direction, and then you redirect them in a shocking way, and that makes it funny. So
that's going back to some of these benign violations we were talking about.
I think taboo is one of my favorite devices to use. So when you say that something is true, but it's quite like naughty to say that it's true. For example, one of the most famous ads is Dumb Ways to Die, and this was basically about rail safety in a train station.
It was public transport safety in Australia, I think.
Public transport safety, exactly. And that it is a dumb way to die, but it's not quite right to say it. But there's something funny about it, and so they leaned into it. They used this as a humorous way to to create their campaign.
I think that's a wonderful example of what you were talking about earlier, Sophie, about cultural context, because that worked really well with an Australian audience. You know, they're quite blunt, they're quite straightforward. This was a great way to communicate with that audience. And it then took off around the world as a campaign, and it grew a life of its own. But would it have grown that life if it had been started somewhere else, if it had been started in the UK, if it had been started in France?
I think it would have landed in the UK, that kind of advert. I think it would probably have been quite divisive. I think you'd have had the Daily Mail going, what is this country coming to that we're laughing at this country?
We can die however we want.
Exactly. But I actually think that that's probably an area where there is some crossover with the Australian psyche, where I think that sort of advert would probably have landed with a certain portion of the UK population.
I'm just thinking if we'd put that in Germany, I can see, well, you know, because it worked because clearly they were addressing in Australia a certain behavior, cultural behavior that they needed to curb, which was people doing reckless things in and around public transport. Whereas I could see if that had been played in Germany, the Germans would go, yeah, that is a dumb way to die. And then would continue to stand at a red light. Even if no cars are coming, they will stand at a red light and not cross till the green.
I've just finished living in Germany after 4 years, and you can always spot the non-Germans because we're the ones who go up to the traffic light, see there's no traffic for about 3 miles in either direction, and we cross, and the Germans, nein, das ist verboten.
Yeah. Muss nicht. Yeah, my father's German. I feel so bad when I go over there, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, I'm German most of the time. I love sausage, but I'm crossing the road.
But there are always things that break the mold, don't they? So we talk about how humor maybe doesn't work everywhere, but strangely, train spotting is popular quite internationally, but you can't get any more Scottish than that. Even in the language, the book itself is written completely in a kind of Scottish slang, but it still travels. So maybe there is something about authenticity that still travels, and people don't mind if it's different as long as as long as they're authentic to who they are in the first place.
Do you know, the one genre of advert that it fascinates me that they've never really tried to make them humorous are perfume and aftershave adverts, because they are preposterous to the point of humor, but they're not funny and they're not trying to be funny. But it amazes me that they've stuck, you know, in some ways they're very imaginative because they're trying to sell a scent, which is something that's difficult to do on a screen. So in some ways they're quite imaginative, but in other ways you always know it's a perfume ad or an aftershave ad. They follow a very kind of fixed template. It amazes me that they've always stuck to that and haven't tried. I mean, even with deodorant, you'll get some humorous deodorant adverts, but aftershave and perfume have always stuck at, you know, oh, look at this swan made of glass, you know, for some reason. Whereas I think I personally would respond better to an advert that said, stop smelling like a big bastard and put on this aftershave.
Your train of thought is, exactly right. For when you're doing creative work, you always want to do the thing that nobody else is doing. If we were to get a luxury brand, we would go the other way. We would try to make it funny just because nobody else has done that before.
I guess that's the question. I mean, can you be funny and purpose-driven? Would that sell to the audience that luxury brands target? I mean, I presume that luxury brands are sold that way because their audience takes themselves equally seriously.
I think the best example I can give is the Economist ads. So they had a headline that said, "I never read The Economist, management trainee, age 42. If even people who are privileged, they don't want to admit it, but they are elitist. And if you play on the right tone and tap into the idea that you are, complimenting them and that they have a little giggle. It's not a laugh out loud. It's not a slapstick. It's like a, I get this ad, but maybe a non-economist reader doesn't get that ad. So again, I always think
management trainees.
Yeah. I always think there's a way to adjust your tone. So I would try to challenge any client and say that any ad has the potential to be funny. It's just about dialing the tone up and down.
And there's something about kind of getting getting the voice right. So there's a really basic study in showing that if people rate jokes as funnier if they think they were told by somebody who was known to them to be a comedian than if they think they were told by someone who's not a comedian. So people will rate a joke funnier if they think it was told by Sarah Millican than if they think it was told by Jamie Oliver. And in fact, it's just written down. I mean, there's no... So there's something about that kind of social role as well, and the authenticity of how that's coming over. If that looks like it's going to land, then it will already make it funnier if you can kind of frame it that way. So the Economist has always been witty in its advertising, for as long as I can remember. It's kind of part of how it's presented itself in advertising. And there's also a really interesting paper I was reading about humour in the workplace and leadership, because I mean everyone's kind of seen the Office and these nightmare bosses, and Michael Scott or David Brent, kind of just coming in and everyone cringing out a kidney because they're doing something appalling. And this paper basically bore it out. And what they found was that there's humour from a leader in the workplace can be incredibly important, and people can really value it and benefit from it and report feeling happier in the workplace because of it. Not just because it happens. It has to happen in a context where that leader feels like they're actually engaging with the workforce as well. People feel like they're being engaged with, and the humour's part of that. And I think that's quite significant. And I think it speaks to what you're saying about advertising, because it's got to feel like it's not been ported in. I think you will enjoy this because it's funny. So now it's happening. It's more about, this is a dialogue that we're already having. This is a relationship we already have. And within that relationship, me being funny will actually be something you'll enjoy and feel better for. Does that make sense? I think it's not separate from what you're describing.
Basically suggesting that work will also be fun.
Yeah.
But saying, and a safe, and actually laughter in the workplace makes it a safer space, doesn't it? It doesn't, because often in the absence of laughter is fear or is negative emotion. Laughter lets us know that there is room to actually be at ease in a situation, which, brings us really nicely actually into my question for you, Ash, where we talk about this in medical comms in terms of what are some of the places and spaces you think that humor could make communication more effective in that space, given how much negative emotion can exist in that arena.
I mean, I think humor can be a great tool for normalizing experiences, because I think that oftentimes, and dependent upon health condition, people may live with things and either not be aware that it's something that they should have checked out, or they may live with a sense of shame that they have to live with certain, health conditions. But actually, if you can find the genuine humor in that and make people feel, do you know what, it is okay to live with this condition, or it is okay to experience this particular type of symptom, then I think that there's a positive effect that can come out of that. I think as well, you can also raise awareness. So, I mean, there are people who just tolerate living with certain health conditions because they've never thought to question it. And I think that there's good evidence that lots and lots of people go through life just accepting chronic pain, for example, because they just think, well, I wake up and it hurts, and that's how they go through their life. But if you can actually find a way of saying, maybe there's an underlying reason for your pain every morning, or maybe there's a reason that it hurts when you go to the toilet, or whatever the symptom is, you can actually start increasing disease awareness. So even if it's not, I'm not even necessarily here talking about coming at it from a pharmaceutical perspective, but from a health regulator, from a patient advocacy group, whatever the healthcare oriented group is, I think that you can really reach out to groups of patients and firstly normalize what they're going through, but also raise awareness of the fact that actually maybe there's a rare condition that you've just been living with, that you should get checked out because maybe there's a way to treat it, or maybe there's a way to manage it. So I think that humor in that context it can be a very positive tool. And again, I think it has to come from that place of authenticity where it's an empathetic reach out humor in that context. I think that you have to be saying, if you're going to use humor in that context, it has to be to make an actual connection with the patients and say, you are living with a valid set of conditions, but it's, maybe there's something darkly humorous that you can bring out of that. So I think that that's a positive element that you can bring into healthcare communications broadly. And like I say, I think that's applicable whether you're talking about the NHS doing patient awareness, whether you're talking about patient advocacy groups trying to raise awareness of a new treatment that's available, for example, or trying to get the NHS to expand their treatment algorithm, or their provision of services. Humor can be a very powerful and useful tool in the healthcare setting. And I think that, yes, there always has to be a question around appropriate use of humor, but this is where, again, I come back to the authenticity point, that I think if you are approaching it from a truly empathetic point of view, which, obviously if it's a patient advocacy group that's doing this, they're going to be coming at it as patients who are then able to have a sense of humor about their condition in a way that a non-patient wouldn't, if you know what I mean. So that's my rambling answer.
No, it's brilliant. In fact, you actually, within your answer, answered my second question, which is, what are some of the objectives that humor can help health marketers meet? And, you said awareness, normalization, toleration, patient advocacy, which is incredible. Can you give me some examples of where that's been particularly successful in medical comms?
So I think that there's always two sides to sort of medical communications. And I think that you have the very scientific, dry side of medical communications, and that will be your straightforward publications. But then you will have, again, just disease state awareness campaigns. And sometimes these can be very dry, oh, did you know that 1 out of 4 of us lives with this condition or that condition? And that's very dry. And I'm struggling because all of the examples have just gone completely out of my head.
I have an example. So
please jump in and rescue me.
The Leith agency did one about checking for signs of cancer. And the idea was, the early bird catches the worms. So they used all kinds of birds to demonstrate the symptoms of cancer. So, for example, the bald eagle had a spot on his head for skin cancer. The flamingo had a stool sample. And so it was interesting to use, it was an animation of birds to then demonstrate a patient's symptoms, which it might not be very comfortable for people to look at. So instead of showing, real people, we used birds to show it. And it was quite a funny kind of sketch just because of the randomness of using a flamingo to look at a stool sample. So that's one example of using humor in health comms.
They're lucky they caught it. It has so far to fall.
And actually, an example that does spring to mind is if you think about sort of the erectile dysfunction, for example, probably 5-10 years ago, that would have been erectile dysfunction. People would have said it under their breath. But now I think they've been very effective at using humor to normalize erectile dysfunction. And you see the adverts on TV all the time. You see sort of posters for products to support erectile dysfunction. And I think that obviously there's been a commercial aspect to that there are particular pills that certain companies will want to sell. But I do think that it brings a benefit that sexual dysfunction affects a lot of people at different points in their life. And the fact that people can now talk about ED or whatever their sexual dysfunction is in a way that isn't just a private shame they're living with is a really good thing. And so that's an example of an area where, yes, of course, for the companies that make particular erectile dysfunction drugs, they will be seeing a commercial benefit from that. But I actually think there is a broader societal benefit where if people feel much more comfortable talking about their erectile dysfunction, I know that this is the example that we picked on, then that's probably healthy for people because they don't have to sit there and think, this is something super embarrassing that I can't possibly. I mean, I'm not saying they should go out and talk about it on the bus, to anybody, but if they can at least be open and honest, I think that's a good thing. And I think there's lots of healthcare conditions where a similar positive effect, mental health, for example. I think that's something that is very difficult to bring humor to in a sensitive way. But I think that there are ways that it could be done. And I think that increasing the ability of people to say, do you know what, I'm really struggling with this element of my mental health. I'm really struggling with my OCD. I'm really struggling with my ADHD, whatever element it is. And I think that we've come a long way in that already. But I think that that's another area where bringing humor into the topic, and there's lots of comedians who talk about their mental health problems in a way that I think has been healthy for people.
Yeah, I totally agree. Humor has changed. Comedy has changed recently and opened up these avenues of conversation, which then can trickle into advertising and health communication because it's becoming, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe, they've allowed us to speak more about it, but it's certainly opened up more and more ways that we can speak humorously about what previously has been considered very serious, if not unspoken of subjects, such as ED, especially ED, where if you suffer from it, the only other person who's ever going to really know about it is going to be your partner. And so it isn't something that you would tend to bring up in the, hey, guys, anyone else struggling to get it? No, just me and the wife. Right, great. Yeah, next round's on me. It's as you said, it can be quite awkward. I think we've covered some amazing things in this episode. We started just by learning about different types of humor. So, we don't think until you drill into it, you don't realize that you can actually categorize it. We started with the idea of slapstick, which is physical, which everyone can understand, even quite young children can understand what slapstick is. Then the next level seems to be bringing language into it. And with language comes context and cultural perspective that can make something funny in one part of the world, but very much not funny in another part. And we talked about how humor doesn't always translate between cultures. We talked about the science of communication and looking at the roles that it plays in brands and how brands can use that to great effect. But again, we're talking about who is our audience, who are we speaking to, and also where are we sourcing our humor from, which we've covered a couple of times, especially with regards to health communication and medical communication, making sure that we source our humor appropriately so that there is an authenticity, so that we can hope to, as we said, land the jokes that we are saying, because unfortunately, if it doesn't land, we all know this. If it ain't funny, it ain't funny. And that's something that we can't always predict. And we're all familiar with examples of where something's come out well-intentioned and has missed the mark. So we also talked about the fact that even though something might be intended in a particular way, it might not be received in that way. And that's something that anybody working in advertising, especially medical and health comms, should definitely bear in mind when creating their humor, because if you do it right, it can have great effect in terms of the objectives of raising awareness, normalizing conditions, increasing toleration or tolerance for certain conditions in society, but also within your own life if you're living with something that you didn't think that you had the right to maybe speak up about. And of course, in areas of patient awareness and patient advocacy. Thanks again for joining me on A Healthy Dose of Humor. And remember, if you're interested in hearing more about the topic of health and humor, or connecting with any of our series contributors, you can access all of that and more at leith.co.uk/healthydose.